The auditorium was packed, everyone dressed in their best, clapping, cheering, and waiting for the man of the hour, my father, to take the stage. He had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, and today was supposed to be a celebration. I sat in the front row, my chest tight with a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. When he finally stepped up to the podium, the room erupted with applause. But within moments, my heart sank. He didn't just thank people or reflect on his career, he looked straight at me. My father's smile was sharp, controlled, but it hit a cruel twist I couldn't have predicted. "Of course," he said loudly, voice echoing through the hall, "my children always think they're capable, but sometimes they really aren't ready for the real world." A hush fell over the room. My stomach dropped. Every eye turned to me. I felt their curiosity, their judgment, as if I had failed before even taking a single step. I wanted to speak up to defend myself, but the words froze in my throat. I sat there, trapped under the spotlight of his disappointment and ridicule. Every joke, every pointed comment he made was like a public punch. The laughter that followed wasn't funny, it was stabbing. My chest ached, my hands trembled slightly, and yet I stayed silent. Why didn't I respond? Because that's what he wanted. My silence became part of the performance, the perfect stage for his ego. And as the crowd clapped for him, oblivious to the storm inside me, I realized something chilling. The man I had admired for so long didn't see me as a daughter or even as a person worthy of respect. But in that moment of pain, a seed was planted. The humiliation burned, yes, but it also lit something far more dangerous. A quiet, simmering resolve. One day, the power would shift. One day, he would know exactly how it felt to be exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. The auditorium had gone silent, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every head turned my way, every gaze heavy with expectation, judgment, and curiosity. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck as my father's words sank deeper. He leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with amusement. "And of course, my daughter, she's always had interesting ideas. Some might even call them failures in the making." A ripple of laughter ran through the audience. Not the polite, respectful kind. It was mocking, sharp, and relentless. I felt frozen, as if invisible chains held me to my chair. People I barely knew, colleagues of his, distant relatives, even his friends, were watching me squirm, and some of them were smiling, some whispering. My pride, my dignity, my sense of belonging, all of it seemed to crumble in real time, under the fluorescent lights and the gaze of 100 strangers. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to yell, cry, anything, but my voice didn't come. My silence became a spotlight, amplifying every cruel word he flung like daggers. Every chuckle, every sideways glance from the audience, every forced clap in his favor reminded me I was powerless in that room. And then came the clincher, his final jab of the evening. "But that's okay," he said, smirking at the audience. "We can't all reach the top. Some of us are destined to stay in the background." The crowd laughed again, louder this time. And I sat there, burning with humiliation, my heart pounding, my hands clenched so tight they ached. For the first time, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about control. He had staged this moment to dominate me, to remind everyone who held the power in our family. But the pain he inflicted, the shame he relished, he had no idea it was also lighting a fire inside me. Because silence, I learned that day, can be as powerful as words, and I wasn't going to stay silent forever. After the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse, I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. My father was still smiling on stage, basking in the admiration of everyone else, but I felt none of it. Walking home that evening, each step was heavy. I replayed the event over and over in my mind, the smirks, the laughs, the way he deliberately made me feel small. My cheeks burned not just with embarrassment, but with a quiet, smoldering anger. Pain had a strange companion, clarity. I saw him for who he truly was, not just a father, but a man who used public approval as a weapon, who thrived on control and humiliation. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't beg for understanding. I stayed silent, not because I was weak, but because I was learning, observing, planning. Every conversation, every glance, every careless boast he made in front of others became a clue, a piece of a puzzle I was slowly assembling. In that silence, a subtle shift began. I realized that humiliation, though excruciating, could be transformed into power. And the louder he celebrated himself, the easier it would be to orchestrate a response that he would never see coming. The shame he had tried to embed in me was now fueling something entirely different: resolve, patience, and a strategy. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next time the world watched him, I wouldn't be the one shrinking under the spotlight. The power balance had started to shift, quietly, invisibly, like a storm forming on the horizon. The days after that humiliating speech felt strangely empowering. While my father continued to bask in his retirement glory, I began to observe, learn, and plan. I watched how he interacted with people, his colleagues, old friends, even strangers. Every word he said, every boast he made, every arrogance-laced joke was a thread I could pull, a weakness I could exploit. I started small. I refined my skills, built connections, and gathered information. I didn't make a scene, didn't challenge him publicly, because the best revenge isn't loud, it's invisible until the perfect moment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I positioned myself where he least expected it. The more I acted behind the scenes, the more I noticed something. People were beginning to see him differently. The cracks in his armor, the pride, the arrogance, the occasional selfishness became apparent. And I realized that power isn't just about public applause, it's about perception, control, and timing. I kept my demeanor calm, even warm around him. If he expected bitterness, resentment, or open confrontation, he was disappointed. That disappointed glance, that subtle underestimate, became my greatest weapon. He thought I had been defeated, but all the while I was gaining leverage, silently reshaping the dynamics between us. And in that silence, the scales began to tilt. The person who had once humiliated me was now unaware that the balance of power had already begun to shift. Every conversation, every interaction, every choice I made was calculated to build toward a moment he would never see coming, but one he would never forget. The day finally came. Everything had been set, every detail meticulously planned, every ally and audience positioned without his knowledge. My father walked into the room, confident, smug, convinced he was still in control. The same arrogance that had once humiliated me now blinded him to what was about to happen. I greeted him warmly, masking the storm that had been brewing inside me for months. He didn't suspect a thing. And then, with calm precision, I began. It started with subtle reminders of his missteps, his arrogance, his public slip-ups, presented not as attacks, but as facts. Colleagues exchanged surprised glances, whispers began to ripple through the room. The laughter he had once commanded at my expense now hesitated, faltered, and eventually shifted to a stunned silence. Then came the final revelation. A story, carefully curated and undeniable, that exposed his behavior, not in the abstract, but in full clarity in front of the people whose admiration he had always craved. The shock on his face was instantaneous, his smile faltering, his composure crumbling. He had been the one controlling the narrative until that very moment. The room went silent. Every eye that had once judged me now witnessed the power reversal firsthand. The humiliation he had inflicted on me replayed, reflected back tenfold. And I realized in that victorious, quiet moment, justice didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to scream. It only needed timing, patience, and precision. For the first time, he understood the weight of his actions. And I finally felt the release, the satisfaction of reclaiming not just my dignity, but my power. After the shock settled and the room emptied, I stood alone for a moment, letting it all sink in. The anger, the humiliation, the months of quiet planning, it had all led to this. My father's pride, once untouchable, had been humbled. And yet the victory wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about justice, balance, and reclaiming my voice. In that silence, I realized something essential. Pain and humiliation can shape us, but they don't have to define us. They can teach resilience, patience, and clarity. The very tools he had used to control me, public scrutiny, manipulation, mockery, had been turned against him, not with malice but with precision and foresight. He no longer held power over me. The shame he once inflicted had been transformed into strength, confidence, and wisdom. And the moral lesson was undeniable. True authority doesn't come from fear, ego, or public applause. It comes from respect, integrity, and the courage to act justly, even when no one is watching. As I walked away that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The pain had passed, the silence had been my ally, and the balance of power was restored. Life had finally taught my father, and me, that no one, not even a parent, should underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has been wronged but refused to break.